Breaking down the good and the bad from Graham Barton, that and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this Monday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listener view every single day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And, of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho, at @JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers as deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, plus one-on-one conversations with me via text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play. What can you realistically expect from Graham Barton? That is coming up after a little while, but I want to dive into what I saw from Barton as I went through and watched 3 different Duke football games from 2023, and here's how that went. So I chose these games based on Pro Football Focus individual game grades from last season. Pro Football Focus is something that I've referenced a couple of times, but as many of you longtime everydayers know, I don't view PFF as gospel or the end-all be-all. I use it simply as a tool and a metric to compare things against. So based on their grades, I chose his best game, which was the final week against Pitt, and then his 2 lowest graded games, home against Northwestern in week 3 and on the road at Florida State in week 8. So let's start with the top graded game, the final game of the regular season for the Duke Blue Devils against Pitt. This was his highest graded game at an 80.2, but I will say this, Barton only played 24 snaps in this game due to suffering an injury and being removed in the first half. I couldn't find any information on what that injury was or whether or not he would have been able to go back in if needed, but he did leave before halftime of that game. One of the biggest plays that stood out to me was during the opening drive. Duke faced a 4th and 1 from the 50 and opted to go for it. So Barton initially takes on the defensive end before pushing him out of position and seamlessly transitioning to a blitzing linebacker, which allowed there to be enough time for the quarterback to find an open receiver and convert on that play. A few trends that I noticed throughout this game was his consistent ability to establish position and really impose his will in the run game. With Barton in the game, Duke ran primarily to the outside or between Barton and the left guard because of the confidence they had in Barton to seal off defenders and open up running lanes. Then his ability to shed defenders and get to the second level without any issue at all, and allowing him to become a lead blocker was beyond impressive. His movements upfield were really fluid and quick for a guy his size, but beyond that, he didn't allow a pressure. He didn't allow a sack when in pass blocking, and his side was sealed off every single snap, sometimes getting a pop on a defensive lineman before switching to an edge rusher or a blitzing player and just completely shutting them out. Something that really stood out as well was how good Barton was against speed, as well as his ability against power rushes. And this is something that I really wanted to focus on because of how often he is going to face those power bull rushes as an interior offensive lineman. he showed absolutely no weakness either way, regardless of how Pitt wanted to try and attack him. He was patient, he was disciplined, and his high football IQ, which is something else that really kind of popped off the screen. I'll talk more about that throughout this episode. It allowed him to quickly assess what his assignment was doing and react perfectly every single time. So I can see really why this was PFF's highest graded game for Barton last season. He was textbook from start to finish, but again, only 24 snaps in this game. So, there could have been other things that popped up later in the game had he continued to play. It was easy probably for him to post such a high grade with such a limited amount of snaps. But you saw it time and time again, pushing edge defenders who were coming in on a speed rush out of position and causing them to over pursue and keep that pocket clean for his quarterback. The guys that were power rushing, Barton a lot of times would use their own strength against them, causing them to lose their footwork or lose their power, lose their positioning, and in turn lose the rep. Barton was incredibly impressive. But again, you go back to Pitt last year, not super talented. He wasn't going up against a Kalijah Cansey in this one. So he was by far the best player in the trenches for both teams when these two squared off. But again, you can lose to lesser players if your technique isn't sound, if your footwork isn't working for you. And that was something else that I'm going to talk about coming up in a little bit, that Barton would lose at times. This isn't going to be all sunshine and rainbows. There are going to be criticisms and critiques of Barton because he's not perfect. He's not, going to win 100% of the time. But it was about how did he match up against different types of attacks? How did he assess those situations? How did he play into those for an advantage against who he was going up against? And really, I couldn't find a single thing wrong with Barton's approach in this game against Pitt. Really, really impressive stuff. But because that was so impressive, that's why I wanted to move on to a couple of the lowest graded games for Barton last season. I wanted to see the difference between what PFF considered his best performance and what PFF considered his worst two performances. And I wanted to see if there was a stark difference between the two. So the next time up, I flipped on the game against one of the nation's best teams and against that team in their house, Duke going on the road, to see how he held up against guys like Jared Verse, who was a first-round pick, Braden Fisk, who was a second-round pick. Having not watched that game during the college football season, I had no idea that Duke nearly beat Florida State. And if you just looked at the final score of a 38-20 Seminole win, you would ask what in the world I was talking about. But I dive into that one coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, parlays, and much, much more. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. The Boston Celtics are the favorites to win the NBA Finals at plus 105, followed by the defending champion Denver Nuggets at plus 500, and the team that they're facing off against right now, the Minnesota Timberwolves, third in line at plus 600. In the race for Lord Stanley's Cup, the greatest trophy in all of sports, the Carolina Hurricanes are the favorite at plus 400, followed by Connor McDavid and the Edmonton Oilers at plus 430, then the Florida Panthers at plus 490. Notice the team that finished with the President's Trophy, the New York Rangers, are not in the top three in Stanley Cup odds. If you disagree, or maybe you do agree, visit FanDuel.com/locked-on and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listener view every single day. Every dayers, make sure you are coming back tomorrow. Plenty more to discuss with this Buccaneers team as they prepare to get ready for mini camp. In the meantime, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Switching over to that game against the Florida State Seminoles, I was curious to see why PFF gave Barton a grade of 61.3, which was his second lowest of the season. And honestly, I am still not sure. More impressive play from Barton in this one. A play that did stand out was in the second quarter when Barton gave up a sack. He appeared to hesitate for just a moment. He lost his footing, and it allowed the defender to get in Riley Leonard's face, and that pressure resulted in an interception for the Seminoles. My biggest thing after seeing that play was, how did Barton respond? He responded with a highlight reel of a drive. Back-to-back plays, he absolutely manhandled the guys across from him in run blocking, including on a 3rd and 6 from the Florida State 46-yard line. He created a lane to open up for the running back to get a 25-yard run. Duke would go on to score on that drive. He is so quick at getting his hands on the first guy and redirecting him to give himself space to get to the next level and attack a linebacker, creating even more running room for those running backs. And something else that I took note of were his assignments throughout the game. More often than not, Barton was up against edge rusher Jared Verse and defensive lineman Braden Fisk, both now with the Rams. Verse, the first-round pick, Fisk, the second-round pick. He allowed just one pressure and no sacks between those two players. That one pressure came after Riley Leonard left the game when he re-aggravated his ankle injury, and the backup held on to the ball for far too long inside the 5 and ended up having to throw it away when the pressure got to him. Before Leonard left the game, the Blue Devils were leading in this one. Afterwards, the offense just couldn't move the ball and the wheels fell off, and it allowed Florida State to score 21 unanswered in the fourth quarter and win the game. Ultimately, I didn't see anything outside of that sack that he allowed to justify such a low score. He was about as consistent as you could ask for. So I went ahead, I moved on, jumped to the lowest graded game, which was at home against Northwestern in week 3 of the season. So 2 home games and a game on the road, but same thing in this game as there was in the Florida State game. Barton was beat for a sack after he hesitated for a half second, found himself out of position, couldn't recover, and the edge rusher just blew right past him and got the sack using that speed. After that, though, no pressures, no sacks allowed, and Barton bounced back against that speed. At one point, the defenders started with the speed rush to try to bait Barton, to go a little bit too deep, hit him with the spin move to try to cut inside, and he was absolutely stonewalled by Barton's quick hands and his power, pushed him off balance, got him onto the ground. That was the kind of running theme in these games that I watched. If Barton got beat, whether it was for a sack or a pressure, he wasn't going to get beat by the same guy a second time. He learns and adapts in real time, which might be one of his best attributes. And it goes back to what I said about his football IQ. To go along with his strength, his quickness, his power, he can process what he is seeing so quickly and put himself in the best position to win that rep. Mind you, all of these games, all of these reps that I watched came at left tackle. So there's going to be an adjustment there as he has to transition from that outside blocker to an interior offensive lineman. But plenty of what I saw is going to translate really, really well. At the end of the day, Barton was a first-round pick for a reason, and that reason was because he was reliable. If he got beat, he adapted. If he wasn't getting beat, he made sure to give himself the time and the space needed to process what he's seeing, adapt to what the defender is doing, and not get lulled essentially to sleep or into a false sense of security because he was having his way with these opposing defensemen. It was picking up blitzing linebackers. It was shoving these interior defensive linemen out of position so that he can quickly make the transition and switch over to another player, allowing Riley Leonard or whoever the quarterback was enough time for his reads to progress and a receiver to get open, or for these running backs to be able to hit a crease, hit a hole that more often than not, he was the one sealing off and be able to create 5, 6, 7 yard gains out of the backfield. It was beyond impressive what I was watching. And I can't stress enough how smart of a football player they had in Graham Barton, and now how smart of a football player the Buccaneers have in Graham Barton. He was a do-it-all guy. He was sealing the edge. He was bouncing and stunting to the inside to help the run blocking and create lanes for running backs. He was the everything. And if Barton happened to have a rep where he failed or he got beat, you could see the rest of the offensive line kind of crumbled around him. I've never witnessed an offensive line where the anchor and the guy that really controlled everything was an edge blocker. The anchor always comes from the interior. It always comes from the middle. And that was one of the big struggles that the Bucs had last year. The anchor, Robert Hainsey, was struggling because the guy next to him along the interior was also struggling. Matt Filer, Aaron Stinney, they couldn't get it going, and it hampered what Hainsey was able to do and the ceiling that Hainsey had last season. This year, with Graham Barton, things are going to be completely different. So, before diving into all of that a little too much, what is it that Graham Barton brings to the Buccaneers, switching from a tackle to an interior offensive lineman? I dive into that next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. All right, game off. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go, and I know what you're saying. Flag on the play. You've already talked about that, but there's just so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with your friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock, and there's just so much to get. You can get unique stickers that you trade with your friends and complete albums for big prizes. There's cool new playing pieces that you can travel to different boards with. And there are hilarious emojis for taunting those friends of yours when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton of them include your own unique mini games like digging for treasure or robot pachinko machines. There's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything that you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and go download it now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. Wrapping things up here on a Monday edition of the Locked On Bucs podcast. So how does everything that I watched from Graham Barton translate from left tackle to interior offensive lineman? The biggest trait that I can take, regardless of if Barton is the center or the left guard, for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to assume that he's the center. That's what he was announced as at the draft. That's where I think he will end up, is the huge upgrade that Barton brings to the run game. Snap after snap, I watched Barton move his defender out of the way and move on to the next guy. And I don't just mean like move him. I mean absolutely dictate where another grown man was going to go against their will, which was generally into the face of another defender to completely remove them from the play, then looking upfield for the next player that he was going to lay a helmet on. That kind of power and control of another human being and then getting upfield to become a lead blocker is something that the Bucs just didn't have last year. For as good as Hainsey could be at times, and we saw that back in 2022, there was so much deficiency at the left guard spot that he couldn't break off those blocks and get upfield to help Rashad. He couldn't block two guys at once to prevent the interior pressure from getting to Baker Mayfield. Now, those running lanes are going to be a little bit bigger, and they're going to be open for a little bit longer. As far as short yardage is concerned, you all know how concerned I was with the Bucs needing to bring in that bigger short yardage running back. With Barton in the middle, he is so good in those short yardage or those goal line situations at getting low and taking out the defensive lineman that Rashad may not face much resistance up the middle following Graham Barton for those conversions. All he's really going to need to do is get to the line of scrimmage and fall forward with his 6-foot frame and be able to get that yard that the Buccaneers need. As far as pass protection is concerned, I think constant interior pressure that Baker was up against and had to escape on multiple occasions last year isn't going to be nearly as prevalent in 2024. I'm not saying it's going to be non-existent, especially with the questions still surrounding the left guard job, whether that's Opeta or Bredesen, but it's going to be noticeably less than last year. And that brings me really to my last point and how it'll play into Barton's impact from the center spot. Something that I mentioned a few times and something that I saw almost on a loop through all of these snaps that I watched from the Duke offense is how Barton would overpower a guy and then move on to another. Look for that to continue to happen in order for Barton to give some help to the left guard. It's going to be much more difficult at the NFL level. Granted, he's not going to have to go up against Aaron Donald, which is great. But if he can get that initial pop on a defensive tackle, the way that I saw him getting it at Duke, and then kind of force them off their path to buy just enough time to turn his attention over to the left side and whoever the left guard is having to go up against, it's going to give that left guard much more help than Hainsey was able to last year. Barton's superpower, I guess you can call it, beyond how quickly he processes information and what level of IQ he has, is his ability to get that initial strength and that initial shove to really force a defender off their spot or off their path and be able to take out the next guy. It is, I implore you to go and watch some Duke football games from last year and see how effortless Graham Barton makes that move look, where you can just two hands real fast, pop a guy, shove him down, and then move on to the next. And it helped against other, hand in the dirt down linemen. It helped against blitzing linebackers. It helped against blitzing corners. At times, it is something that he does with such ease that you would think that it was the easiest thing in the world for an interior offensive lineman to do. But in reality, we know how difficult that is because we saw how poorly the Bucs offensive line played when you didn't have a guy that could do that. So overall, I really didn't think that I could like this Graham Barton pick more than I did for the Buccaneers on draft night. But watching some of these games, especially the ones that were considered his worst of the 2023 season, the Bucs legitimately got a potential Pro Bowl and all-pro caliber player. Think of it this way. Think Tristan Wirfs at the center position. And that's what the Buccaneers just landed with the 26th pick in the 2024 NFL draft. I know I said draft grades are, right after the draft are just projections. All you're doing is trying to confirm your own pre-draft opinion. And you can't truly grade a player until 3-4 years later when they've been in the league, when they've gone against NFL caliber talent week after week after week. But I will legitimately be shocked if we look back on this draft pick that the Buccaneers had and give it anything less than an A. Graham Barton is a franchise-changing offensive lineman for a team that is going to run the ball as much as the Bucs are going to try to, with the addition of Bucky Irving to go with Rachaad White, to go with Chase Edmonds, for a quarterback like Baker Mayfield, who faced so much pressure last year and had to escape a lot of that because of the interior of the offensive line not being able to hold up against strong and speedy defensive players. You're not going to see that. Baker Mayfield is going to be able to sit in the pocket a little more comfortably, not get those jitters after being knocked around early on in games. Graham Barton is legitimately going to change what this offense can do compared to what they were last year. It's a dangerous addition for any teams going up against the Bucs. They have weapons. Now they're going to be able to protect their quarterback that much better. That is going to do it for this episode of Locked On Bucs. Make sure you are coming back tomorrow. Plenty more to talk about. And there's a roast of Tom Brady that happened on Sunday night that I think we're probably going to end up needing to talk about. All of that is coming up on tomorrow's episode. In the meantime, check out everything that I'm doing over at BucsNation.com. Make sure that you are following on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @JYarcho_Bucs. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, become a Locked On Bucs insider by going to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. Want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.